Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time to start. I'm Alison Bales from the University of Iceland, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you here to this event on behalf of the Institute of International Affairs and Evrópustofu, with whom we're happy to contribute on this topic. This is one of a series of 5 seminars being held over the next few weeks by the Institute on aspects of EU policy which maybe are not so often discussed here in Iceland. And it's the idea to broaden the picture of European integration, not only as it affects Iceland, but the role that it plays in the world as a whole. I will say a little bit more at the end about how that programme will go forward. But today, as you can see, we have a really important subject, which certainly should be of concern to Iceland, human rights and the EU. And we will be looking at it from 2 different angles, or at least 2 different viewpoints. First, the impact on human rights of the economic crash, which has hit everybody in the European area, some harder than others. What effects has that had, not only on economic and social rights of people, but on political rights, discrimination, prejudice, and so forth. For that, we have an extraordinarily well-qualified speaker in Kinga Göncz, who is visiting Iceland for the purpose. In her own country of Hungary, she has had a distinguished career, both academic and political, holding the post of foreign minister at one time, and she is now a member of the European Parliament, very committed to human rights issues and serving, for example, as vice chair of the European Parliament committee that deals with civil liberties, among other things. She will be speaking first, and then we will have a second presentation by Pauline Torrehall, who is representing the European External Action Service in Brussels, and she will be filling in the general picture of EU policy on the topic. Well, my idea is to say as little as possible myself, and I think that I can now leave you in the hands of Kinga Göncz, who is going to make the first presentation on human rights in Europe in the light of the economic crash. Kinga, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for this very nice introduction. I heard that you were saying that it's a topic which hasn't been discussed so often here in Iceland. And it's quite interesting when we speak about the EU, we mostly speak about the single market and the financial cooperation, economic cooperation, the single currency of the European Union. But if you ask the people what they appreciate the most in the European Union, they do not speak about these aspects. They mostly speak about 2 aspects, which is, it might be also 3, but clearly not this one. In one hand, the social security or social policy aspects of the European Union. In one hand, in other hand, the aspect that is most connected with the values and the fundamental principles of the European Union, and it is this aspect. I am also sitting in the petition committee where all of the citizens can submit petitions if they feel that their rights were violated. And most of the petitions are about violations in the field of fundamental rights, even if it is about something else. It's mostly about values and principles which are in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So there is a very special sensitivity in this respect. So I'm really glad to speak about this here, although it is true that we don't hear so much about these issues. And we also see that the crisis, which again was started as an economic crisis, and it turned slowly to different type of, it was started as a financial crisis, then to an economic crisis, then an employment crisis, let's say. And I know that also Iceland was affected quite strongly by this crisis. But throughout Europe, we saw more and more different aspects of this crisis, the public finance crisis, also undermining state services because of the lack of financing, which also had a very strong relation to the fundamental rights, how much people had access to healthcare, access to social care, what happened with the pensions in the different countries, how much they could rely on their rights. In one hand, it was quite influential. In other hand, we see more and more the political aspects and consequences of the crisis. And the political consequences are also affecting quite strongly the human rights and fundamental rights of people, because what we see more and more, it is a stronger voice of the extreme right parties, which are questioning these fundamental rights, which are questioning democracy and rule of law. We will see how much time we have, but we can also discuss a little bit the forecast of the European parliamentary election, which is happening throughout this week, depending on which country organizing in which days of this election. But it's clearly we will see more and learn more by the end of this week what is happening and how will be the next European Parliament in that sense, how much these extreme right and Eurosceptic parties will be represented in the European Parliament. So again, before we go into the details, I would like to mention that the different EU bodies are having quite different positions on these human rights and fundamental rights issues. And it is quite interesting to see. The Commission is the most visible, let's say, but they are quite cautious. They are also sometimes clearly saying that they are following the political agenda of the Council and the Parliament, and they are waiting for the Parliament and for the Council's opinion in these issues. Although they are coming up with proposals, with communication, with draft laws, they are seemingly initiating it, but it is based on the political will of the two other institutions. If it's about human rights and fundamental rights issues, then the Council is very cautious. Ministers and prime ministers are sitting in the Council, and they are dependent on each other. They are very cautious, criticizing each other in that sense. And sometimes it is easier to criticize the financial aspects, the budget, let's say, of another country, than to criticize the situation of democracy and the situation of fundamental rights and the situation of rule of law of another country. Because of different reasons. One of the reasons that it is much more difficult to measure the quality of democracy. And I think if we go into this debate, that it will be also interesting for me to learn more from you about the situation in Iceland, how you see this. There were some attempts to measure the quality of democracy and rule of law. When we compare one of the EU country to Belarus or to one of the third countries not having a democracy, it is very easy to say that we have well-developed democracies all over the European Union. Once we try to compare democracy and rule of law situation inside of the EU, then it is much more difficult to measure. Everywhere there are free and fair elections, everywhere there is a parliamentary democracy, and so on. So when we look at this hardcore data, then we are having equally strong democracies. Where we go beyond this hardcore data, then we see huge differences. Is one of the aspects why it is so difficult to talk about these issues is this. It is very hard to measure. The other, what I mentioned, that these governments are dependent on each other. If they are critical with each other in one sense, then they might not rely on the other government in other issues, financial issues, economic issues, which are extremely important, even more after the crisis and in times of crisis. So it is quite difficult to discuss these issues in the Council. The European Parliament is the body which is the most outspoken and most vocal in these issues. And it's a very interesting setting in the European Parliament. You know that there are different different political groups which are composed from political groups of the different countries. So the political groups are following a certain line, but because there are different national political groups inside of the political groups, there are also quite substantial differences. And I have to tell you that if we speak about how the different national political groups see democracy and rule of law issues, then I see that the Nordic countries are much more sensitive than some of the other parts of the European countries. And it's also something which might be interesting also for you. For example, if we discuss these issues in this LIBE committee, what you mentioned, which is about civil liberties, justice, and home affairs, was set up to deal with these issues, then we see mostly a division between the more progressive political groups and the more conservative political groups. The progressive groups are traditionally the Socialist and Democratic group, the Greens, the ALDE, the Liberals, and the GUE, these European left-wing parties. It is more or less half of the parliament. The other half is the EPP, which is the biggest party recently. We will see what will happen after the election. The EPP is much more conservative. They are much less ready to stand up and represent these issues. And beside EPP, there are more right-wing political groups, the ECR, the EFD, and so on, which are, again, much less. But if we look into the political groups, then we see quite often these Nordic EPP groups, political parties, which are voting together with the more progressive parties, having a very similar position in terms of democracy and rule of law as the progressive parties. So there is another division also. So I think it's quite important because in the parliament you might have an influence if you have a majority, as in all of the parliaments, but in a little bit different setting because there is no ruling party in the European Parliament. In a national parliament, there's always a ruling party having a majority, and most of the time the ruling party can define what is happening in the parliament, even if other parties can influence the legislative work, the legislation. In the European Parliament, there is no party having an absolute majority, so there are different type of coalitions in different issues. And therefore, it is quite interesting to mention that in human rights and fundamental rights issues, it is more or less the setting. Quite often in economic and financial issues, the two big parties are voting together, the SD, the Socialist, and the EPP, the European People's Party, and the member parties of this. So it is the setting, how it is happening in Europe, and we see more and more tensions around this issue. I am sure you know exactly that 2007 was a turning point in terms of fundamental rights situation in Europe, although Europe declared from the very beginning that it is an area of freedom, security, and justice, and an area which is based on values of democracy and rule of law and fundamental rights. But in 2007, in the Lisbon Treaty, it was the year when the Charter of Fundamental Rights was included into the Lisbon Treaty. The question is, or the problem with this, that although it's a beautiful list of different rights, from human dignity, freedom, solidarity, and so on. It's a long document. We cannot cover all of this. It is really, really beautiful in terms of ensuring that people might see their rights implemented. That there is a tiny paragraph, which is the paragraph, it is the 51st, I think, Article 51, which is saying that this type of charter can be enforced on the European level just in case if member states are transposing and implementing EU law. And it is a serious restriction. It means that it's mainly the responsibility of the member states. And from this moment, we see huge differences. As I mentioned, that there are differences in terms of the relation of the different member states and different political parties in terms of fundamental rights and human rights issues. We see also it as a difference between the member states. And the EU does not have real instruments to enforce the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Because it has been an assumption at the beginning that if a member state is joining the EU, then it is more or less a settled democracy, then there is no way back. Everyone could just imagine a way forward, a developing democracy and developing rule of law system, a developing economy, and so on, and a developing welfare system. And what we see as a consequence of the crisis, that there is a way backwards in many sense. And I think it is something that you also experience quite strongly in your country, then how these are interrelated, how an economic and financial crisis can affect people's everyday life and what happens with the families and with the people in this situation. So it is also happening in this field, in the fundamental rights and human rights field, then because these extreme right voices are stronger, and because it is much more difficult to counterbalance these populistic voices. It is very easy to say for a politician that if there are troubles in a country, then the troubles are caused by certain social groups, by a minority, by outside enemies of the country, and it is quite easy to say that the outside enemies are mostly in Brussels, and they are these Euro bureaucrats, let's say, who are forcing our country to give up sovereignty and who are forcing us to adjust to nonsense type of legislations instead of letting us doing whatever we would like to do. We are a nation with a huge tradition, with a long history, with excellent government, with a government which is doing everything for its people. So it is very easy to find enemies everywhere, and when people feel that their life is not as secure as it has been earlier, when they fear that there are some troubles, then they don't mind to accept this type of explanations, and they don't mind to follow the instruction of these politicians. And what we see more and more, that although these extreme right parties are not in governmental position, I think just Geert Wilders' party is the only one. The others are still gaining influence and power, and although we hear more and more that mainstream parties are saying that they are counterbalancing the influence of these extreme right parties, we see the opposite. But we see that the public discourse is more and more defined by these extreme right parties, which are questioning equal rights for everyone. And we see more and more that these mainstream parties are following this type of public discourse. Sometimes also turning their politics into this direction. It is not just public discourse, but see more and more also the political and actual consequences of this. So Europe has to be prepared for a different setting in many countries. And we see in some countries more this risk, in some countries less, but more or less the tendency is there. And you also might have heard several times that Europe was designed as a peace project, starting with the economic cooperation, with the single market, and somehow then developing more and more to other fields of cooperation. And in that sense, Europe has been extremely successful as a peace project. It is the longest ever peace period in Europe since the first seats of the European Union. And it is why Europe is so attractive for other countries. If you just look at Ukraine and what is happening in Ukraine, Maidan and the whole demonstration was started. We don't see the end in this moment, but it was started as a very strong civil movement, not to give up the hopes to come closer to the European Union, which is not just about European Union. It means somehow having the same values, having the same fundamental principles, also for them, for Ukrainian people. So it is extremely attractive. It is also extremely attractive for those who try to come to the European Union as migrants, to have this environment around them. So I think in other parts of the world, and we will hear more about this, foreign policy aspects of the European Union as an area of freedom, security, and justice. It is attractive in one hand. In other hand, what we say more and more, that Europe has to be very careful. Once our partners outside of the Europe see that we cannot control the situation inside of Europe, if people see that we have this expectation toward our partners outside, but we are not keeping the same level of our value-based system, then it might undermine the credibility of the European Union. And it is what we hear more and more in the last years, because it is happening that there are some developments which are not in the good direction, let's say. So what we try to do, what has been happening in the EU institutions. And just before I go into the details, I don't know how we are doing in terms of time. Okay, thank you. It is not unusual what is happening in the EU recently in this field. It has been also said that EU was developing all the time through crises, through different crises. And it is an extremely complicated setting, having more and more member states, now having 28 member states. You can imagine that at the beginning there were 6 people sitting around the table. Now there are 28 people sitting around the table in all of the meetings, minimum. The parliament itself is more than 700 people. Again, very carefully balanced the participation of the different member states. It is extremely difficult to find a balanced type of outcome for all kinds of negotiations and discussions. It is very time-consuming, and it is quite frequently criticized, saying that it is ineffective and cannot move forward and cannot make decisions, which is not true. But I think it is very important to take the time and to take into consideration all of the opinions around, to keep everyone on board, all of the small member states and the bigger member states, also accepting the opinion and the very different opinions of the different member states. You have to listen to each other. You have to listen and understand the position of the different members. And if it does not happen, then I am sure the EU could not operate at all if there would be a non-democratic type of decision-making where the bigger member states having more votes would decide without taking into consideration the opinion of the smaller ones. So it is time-consuming and it is difficult, but it is the only way to do things. And therefore, it is happening through crisis. If there is a crisis, if there is a real pressure to solve a problem, then the EU is able to move forward. Without this type of pressure, it's extremely difficult to move forward. It was also the crisis and the effect of the crisis that EU, and the crisis showed it clearly that behind the euro, behind the single currency, they are very different levels of competitiveness of the different countries. Therefore, the Greek economy was crashed. Therefore, the whole Greek crisis created this huge problem. But it was not just the fault of Greece. It was the fault of not yet finished agenda in the economic cooperation field, having the single currency but not keeping to develop enough or on a developed enough level also those countries which started from a different level, and therefore cohesion funds are so important. Cohesion funds which are helping those regions, not countries but regions, which are underdeveloped to develop more, somehow to have a more even level for the different countries and different regions. So it has been happening in different fields, or something similar happened also with the Schengen area, when the EU introduced this whole Schengen agreement, where the outside countries are controlling the borders. It should be based on trust. Those countries which are inside should rely on those others which are controlling their own borders. But it turned out that the criteria for joining the Schengen zone are quite strong. But once a country joined the Schengen zone, there is no supervision anymore, no scrutiny anymore. And it turned out also after the Arab Spring that people can very easily cross the border between Turkey and Greece, for example. And again, it was a joint effort of the European institutions and all of the member states to share this burden and somehow control these borders together in one hand. In other hand, introducing also a scrutiny mechanism for the Schengen countries. I think it is happening now, but what we see recently in the field of human rights and fundamental rights, that at the beginning there's no scrutiny, no control mechanism has been introduced because it didn't seem to be necessary, but now it is clear that there is a need to introduce this. Now again, the Parliament was the one which was most vocal in this field, saying that it is absolutely necessary, and there was a very strong resistance at the beginning from the Council and also from the Commission side. I am not very happy to say, but Hungary was one of the model countries which was discussed widely in the European Parliament when the government, which was now re-elected, after having a constitutional majority, introduced some changes which were not clearly meeting the criteria of this Copenhagen criteria, which are the criteria for EU accession in terms of democracy, rule of law, media freedom, independence of judiciary, and so on. There were some initiatives. The government passed a media law, which tried to control the media field quite strongly. They changed the constitution on a one-party basis, having this majority, but without any kind of agreement or involvement of anyone else, including the oppositional parties, and so on and so on. They also introduced a new election law, which was again a one-party type of election law, very much favoring the ruling party. So there were some reports in the European Parliament discussing these issues and criticizing these issues, saying that there are some systemic problems. And it turned out that the Commission is able to turn to the European Court of Justice just in case of single legislations. If there are some problems, if some paragraphs, some articles, then they might say that a country and the government, the parliament has to correct it. But they cannot cope with the systemic type of changes which go beyond the individual paragraphs, individual articles. So the parliament tried to come up with a report, which is more a systemic report, describing what is happening and asking the Hungarian government to get engaged into a dialogue and change this type of problematic aspects of these legislations. And there was a huge debate, a competency debate, whether or not the parliament might do this or not, whether it's a competency of the parliament or not, the competency of the parliament. The Hungarian government said that it is not the competency of the parliament, they are not following this instruction. And then the parliament has been working on this issue, saying that it is absolutely necessary to come up with a mechanism which is this type of scrutiny or control mechanism in terms of democracy and rule of law, proposing that a Copenhagen Commission should be created. It is called Copenhagen because I mentioned, and I'm sure you know, that the Copenhagen criteria are the criteria of the accession, and the problem was that after the accession, these criteria are not, cannot be controlled anymore, therefore it would be needed, this type of commission. And after the pressure of the parliament, there were 2 or 3 reports on this, then an ongoing monitoring mechanism is needed in one hand. On the other hand, the crisis mechanism is also needed to step in if there are this type of systemic problems. Then at the end, just before the parliament concluded its sessions, also the commission came up with a communication with the same proposals that it is the first time that the Commission started to speak about systemic breaches. Until now, they were just individual problems and not this type of problems. So I think it is happening what we have been seeing earlier, that there is a process which is quite a long process, quite a slow process, but it is extremely important in terms of the credibility of the European Union toward the so-called third countries, and then we can discuss this foreign policy aspects, but also equally important for all of the member states, because the whole EU is based on mutual trust, and there is more and more cooperation in different fields. People are moving between countries. It is one of the fundamental value or principle is the right of free movement, moving and residing freely in other member states. And in that sense, it's a key question, whether or not people feel that they can move to another member state, they have the same rights, that they know that these rights are guaranteed in all of the member states. And therefore, it is extremely important to have these guarantees also included into the EU scrutiny mechanism. And it is something that we are now struggling with. But I think the processes are very important in that sense. So I stop here, and if there are some questions or discussions, I would be glad to learn more about your situation.
Thank you so much for a very interesting and very frank account. It's clear that this is an issue where we are still in the middle of it, and I hope we should all be keenly interested now in which way it will end. We will be having some time at the end for a more free discussion with the speakers. But if you have some direct questions now, not commentaries, but questions, we could take a couple before we move on. Yes, please.
You talked about the importance of investing politically in any change and taking the time to discuss it at every level. I think in Iceland we sort of had the experience that things can be pushed forward quite quickly, as most politicians seem to think of themselves as rulers, not talkers. And we've seen quite massive failures in that sense, where we had policy implemented quickly and then argued over a period of following decades. Can you sort of elaborate a bit how the EU has come to a place where it can invest politically in taking the time to implement policy, and perhaps mention a policy that has failed in that sense?
Thank you. It's an extremely interesting question. I think, and also not easy to answer, I think it is very important in terms of EU membership, that from this moment, once a country becomes an EU member, is engaged into all kind of dialogues on all levels. And I think it is a kind of EU investment into politics. And I think it is the main strength of the EU. It is not always sanctions and punishments and so on, much more the dialogues. There is a so-called peer pressure. And I really feel that it is something which is happening and which is very important. And there is a huge difference. If I compare the situation of Hungary before the accession and after the accession, I think it is the main difference. We modified our legal system to the acquis before, knowing that Hungary is one of the candidate countries. It was enough guarantee for investors. I think our market economy and institutions have been the same even before. In that sense, nothing happened from the time of, from the day of the accession. What happened, it is this very rich type of network on all levels. And it is how the EU is influencing and investing. I think it is the main channel for this type of influence. It is happening on the prime minister's level. It is happening on the ministers' level. It's happening on the European parliamentary level. It is also happening on the civil organizations level. There are several European networks where all of the national organizations, or many of them, are part of these networks. There are many, many programs for this type of dialogues. And you are asking also about programs or investments which failed. I don't think that they are failing. I think because it is not a one-way type of process. It is quite a complicated process, but it happens quite often that there are initiatives which are not turning out on a way how it have been started, because there are so many different type of influences. Before a legislation is adopted, if we have some minutes, I just describe you how it is happening. There is a proposal coming from the Commission. It goes to the Parliament's committee, meaning that there is a rapporteur for this type of proposal of draft, but meaning also that all of the political groups are giving a shadow rapporteur, and they are communicating with the rapporteur through their shadow rapporteurs. Everyone can table amendments. There were some draft laws where there were around 1,000 amendments. Can you imagine? It means that it's the responsibility of the rapporteur to summarize them, to come up with so-called compromise amendments, trying to propose something which is agreeable for all of the political groups, or most of the political groups. Then first, there is a vote in the parliamentary committee. And if there is a majority, then it goes to the plenary. Then also in the plenary, there is a need for a majority. You see the complication of this whole process. And then it is just one side. Then it is happening also on the council side. There is always a country which is giving the presidency. It is collecting the opinion from all of the member states. They are also coming up with a formal opinion. Then there are the so-called trialogues, where the representatives of the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council are sitting there and negotiating the final text of a legislation. In the last case, when we were preparing the last budget of the EU, and I was in the team negotiating the European Social Fund, it took more than 1.5 years, really discussing all of the expressions and sometimes words, how to formulate an important concept, how it is acceptable for the Council, and so on. So it is not failing or winning something. It is an extremely detailed and long process. But at the end, hopefully everyone agrees with this, and it is something which will be implemented in the member states.
Well, thank you very much. I think if I look at the timetable, we should probably take the second statement, but we will welcome you back at the end for a general discussion. And meanwhile, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Thank you. Our second speaker is Pauline Torahal, and she is going to introduce the human rights policies of the EU. She will particularly focus on some of the aspects we've heard less about so far, international applications of the EU's policies and the kind of instruments used. We have some slides, and Pauline, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. How do I do? I'm a bit technically challenged. Oh, back and forth, okay. That should not be too difficult, we'll see. My name is Pauline Torahal. It's a great pleasure to be here. I didn't know that Iceland was the island in the sun, but that's what I see from this. Now, we'll see. I hope I can manage this, but I should be able to, yes. I will be speaking about the foundations on which EU human rights policy, external policy, is based. A little bit about the architecture and the key messages, how we do things. I hope I'm not going to bore you to tears with that, but I think that may be useful to you. I hope I'm not going to repeat anything that you already know. Then EU action in multilateral fora, where we work. We work very much in the United Nations context, of course. The human rights toolkits, I mean, examples of how we work. And then I will talk about a few areas where we have policies, LGBTI, freedom of expression, and gender policy, and some of the challenges. And I have 20 minutes, right? Okay. I will start in 1948. I will bring you back a little bit in history, but this is to make a point. It was a woman, so that's one of my points here. This is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the head of the commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the UN. And I'm talking about that because at that time it was very important that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was based on various nationalities and political backgrounds, the people in the commission. They were from China, the Soviet Union, Egypt, India, Iran, France, UK, and the Ukraine. And it was important that they represented different cultures and different political thinking when they were creating this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I'll get to why that was important. And you know that the UN was formed in 1945, so there was no lists of human rights in the UN Charter itself, so that's why they had to do this a few years later. Now I have to do this. I have to talk and do the technology at the same time. Development of human rights in the EU. There was a very strong commitment to human rights, rule of law, democratic institutions, protection of constitutional order and rights of the individual at the time of when the EU was started. And the Council of Europe, they had drafted the European Convention on Human Rights that came into force in 1953. As was already mentioned by the previous speaker, we then have the Charter on Fundamental Rights that came into force in 2009. And you know that a member of the EU have to respect human rights. The Treaty of Lisbon, which is the foundation of the EU today, It's kind of our constitution, although we don't say constitution. It's our legal base. Just a second. And it says, it's Article 21 of the treaty that says that the Union's action on the international scene shall be guided by the principles which have inspired its own creation. And if you see, they say the universality and indivisibility of human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for human dignity, the principles of equality and solidarity, and the respect for the principles of the UN Charter and international law. That's the important point here. The EU in the world is just to remind ourselves a little bit about the EU in the world. It's 500 million citizens in 28 countries, and we're the largest donor of development aid in the world, as you probably all already know. And I would just like to make the point that in development policy, it says that the objectives of human well-being and dignity for all are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Millennium Development Declaration. The Millennium Development Goals were set up in 2000, 8 Millennium Development Goals. It expires now in 2015, and not all of them have been met, but these two, the Declaration of Human Rights and the Millennium Declaration, recognize the link between human rights, good governance, and sustainable development. So there is no, that's more and more coming into the discussion, what will happen in the so-called post-2015 development framework, and that it should be human rights based. It's what is being discussed in Brussels. Very, very, very briefly, this European External Action Service is the foreign policy branch of the EU. That's where I work, and that's where most of my colleagues here also work. And that's where the Directorate for Human Rights and Democracy is, which is the motor of human rights work in EU external relation. And we, the colleague in the EES is chairing the Working Party on Human Rights. That's the working party where all the EU member states are. And that's where all human rights actions and policies are discussed. It's with all the 28 member states. It's led by the EES, or chaired by the EES rather, and the Commission also comes in. But that's the real motor of human rights in external relations. Oops. All right. Yeah, okay, we'll go to this one. These are the key messages on EU human rights policy. Human rights, they go through like a silver thread through everything we do. We have gold standards, but there's always room for improvement, of course. We're all very, very aware of that. The EU is committed to universal human rights to be respected by all and without exceptions. So human rights is not something you can pick and choose from. And that leads me into the little bit of the debate going on internationally today. The human rights need to be the same in all countries and not adjusted to each country, because then they start losing their value. And if countries go under the minimum standard of human rights, that's where it becomes problematic. Some countries are today saying that regional culture, customs, or observances of their values should grant them exceptions from what is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the EU is very firm in that, in saying that all human rights should be respected by everybody in the same way. There's, we realize that we cannot implement human rights all by ourselves, of course, from Brussels or from EU delegations. So that means that we have a very strong partnership with civil society organizations all over the world. And because they are the ones that contribute a great deal to promote and advance human rights on the ground. And they work towards the goal of justice, equality, and human dignity. We work very much in international multilateral fora, and we're very committed to a strong multilateral human rights system where we monitor the implementation of human rights and in all over the world, and where we can call all states to account. What is mentioned here is the ANGA, it's called the ANGA Third Committee. It's actually the Committee on Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Affairs. But the UN has 6 committees, so this is the third committee. We're very active in that, that's in New York. We're also active in the Human Rights Council in Geneva and the International Labor Organization in Geneva as well, that uphold the social and labor rights. We support the UN Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay. She is the person in the photo here. And she is the voice of the victim everywhere. The Human Rights Council undertakes what is called universal periodic reviews. It means that they look at human rights of all countries all over the world periodically. So they have now gone through all the UN member states, Sweden, Iceland, all of us. So there are reports on where we're strong and where we're weak. So you can, if you're interested in reading about your country, you can look at the website. We also work with the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is just to give you an overview. Some of the policy documents that rule our work is the EU Strategic Framework and Action Plan. We have EU policy guidelines. I'll get to those later. There's 11 on them. It's very practical working documents for people that work in delegations and how they should look at various issues in the countries they're in. We have human rights country strategies. Those are, you look at a country, the situation in the country, you look at what challenges there are, and you make a list of priorities on how you're going to work with that country. We have annual reports on human rights and democracy, of course. We have a formidable person, EU Special Representative on Human Rights, and that's the person in the photo, Stavros Lambrinidis. He has been working as, it was a new mandate in 2012, when also the Strategic Framework and Action Plan came into be. So he's been working for almost 2 years now, and he's doing a fantastic job. His job is to increase the visibility of human rights in the world. So he meets with everybody and anybody and does a very, very good job. The Strategic Framework and Action Plan was adopted in 2012. It was agreed by the EU member states and the European Commission. It has 97 different actions under 36 different headings. We, of course, have consultations with the European Parliament and with civil society. Yes. The EU policy guidelines. We have guidelines on all of these that you see, all of these areas that you see here. Death penalty, torture, children and our human rights defenders, rights of children, violence against women, and the last one is freedom of expression. That was just adopted as late as the 12th of May, so it's hot off the press. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about 3 different areas. Freedom of the press. This is a map of the state of freedom of the press in the world for the moment. The countries in green, I think Iceland is up there in green, are the countries where the press is free. The countries in yellow are the countries where the press is partially free, and purple is where the press is not free. So this means that only 14% of the world's population are enjoying a free press. So we are lucky, I would say. The EU is repeatedly condemning restrictions to freedom of expression and access to the internet, as well as arrests of journalists and bloggers. And as I mentioned, we came out with new guidelines on freedom of expression, online and offline. The number of journalists killed in 2013 was 71. I used to be a journalist in my former life, so and I was part of Reporters Without Borders in Sweden, so I know this all too well. The EU supports freedom of expression through financial assistance and projects, and particularly through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, both at local and global level. And yeah. This is a quote by the High Representative, who's the European foreign policy chief executive, boss, I would say, Catherine Ashton. And we do consultations with civil society on how to better engage and protect journalists and bloggers. It's at the heart of the new guidelines. We welcomed the European Parliament to made a resolution on 13th of June last year on freedom of the press and media worldwide. And we're repeatedly condemning restrictions to freedom of expression and access to internet in bilateral relations as well as in otherwise. For example, there was an arrest in China last year where we called to Chinese authorities and expressed that they should respect the freedom of expression under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The EU is committed to ensure that the internet and other information and communication technology can remain a driver of political freedom. The internet has made it possible for a lot of people to communicate, not only internally with, in their own countries, but also to other countries. And we're looking at EU security export control policy. There are export controls to certain countries of certain technology. So we respect human rights in cyberspace, and we work against any attempts to block or jam or filter or censor or close down communications networks and interference with electronic means of communication. We work to, now I'm getting into the gender part of the presentation. The EU is very committed to promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women. There are about 200 projects and initiatives currently funded by the EU around the world for gender equality, to help women benefit from education and health care, to work and live free from violence and discrimination, and to assume their rightful place in society. Human rights defenders, people that stand up and defend human rights, very often at the peril of their own lives, are something that we work hard for. We have guidelines for human rights defenders. We promote human rights defenders worldwide. The guidelines on human rights defenders came out 10 years ago, and they have a special reference to women. Since women human rights defenders are very vulnerable, they're often subject to violence, to isolation, they're being ridiculed in their societies, and they have a very hard time. They're very, very courageous people that dare to stand up for the rights of women in their own countries. We work against impunity. The perpetrators often go without trial, particularly in the cases of sexual violence, of course, in conflict countries. There was a landmark UN resolution last year on the protection of women and human rights defenders. And it calls on states to ensure protection of women human rights defenders, to prevent violations and abuse, and to support them. The states are, of course, the upholders of human rights. Excuse me. We have a number of policies when it comes to the protection of rights of women. We have violence against women guidelines, as mentioned. We work at the Commission on the Status of Women every year at the UN in New York. It's the primary policymaking body in the world on gender issues. We support very much the UN Special Representative on sexual violence in conflict, and in development policy, there is an action plan of action on gender equality and women's empowerment. This person you may all recognize. I start this with Eurovision. It's a good example of an LGBTI person who was congratulated officially in all over Europe. And the president of Austria said, it's not just a victory for Austria, but above all for diversity and tolerance that he won. And this is Conchita Wurst. If you don't know him, he won the Eurovision Song Contest. We are working for LGBTI, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and intersex persons, and this has moved higher and higher on the agenda of the European Union in the past years. And it's a very vulnerable group. They're being exposed to persecution in many countries. As of late in Nigeria and Uganda. What we do concretely, we do démarches by the EU delegations. That means that we send letters to the countries that we're in. We do quiet diplomacy. but sometimes we have to do more vocal diplomacy, because quiet diplomacy, the civil society organizations don't always hear what we say in quiet diplomacy, and also it's important maybe for others, other countries to hear. The EU and Uganda, there is, the Uganda instated the Anti-Homosexuality Act, and that is being discussed very much for the moment between the EU delegation and the EU headquarters on how to deal with that. Of course, we would like for them, Uganda, to repeal that law. That's maybe not possible, but maybe we can persuade them to change it and to change the conditions for LGBTI people in their country. The European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights is the key funding instrument for people in the area working for civil society, basically. It's strengthening the role of civil society. It promotes actions covered by EU guidelines, and it's there to build, also to support democratic electoral processes. We do electoral monitoring as well in many countries, but this is, and it has a total of 1.1 billion euros in the period 2007-2013. We may not think that's enough, but it goes a long way. It also has urgency grants. We help human rights defenders that are in danger of being killed in their own countries. If they need to bring their families along, we take care of those as well. It's for people that are really in distress. I'm sorry. The challenges. One could think that human rights spoils a relationship if we bring it up with certain countries, but we have to bring it up. I mean, that's our moral imperative. We have credibility. We can, like this former speaker was talking about, credibility of the EU. There are people that say that we're not very credible because we don't uphold our own human rights inside our countries. And then the current themes, universality versus new relativism, that's what I was talking about a little bit about before, that we consider human rights to be universal and indivisible. And there is a whole new trend since the beginning of the 90s, starting with Somalia. I can see that coming into the countries saying that, no, we don't accept all human rights, we want some of them, but not all of them. This is the extent of my Icelandic. And I would thank you for listening. I'm finishing this with a photo of Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan. I'm sure you all know her. She was the young woman who was shot in her head because she wanted to go to school, and she is campaigning for the girls in Nigeria. And her commitment reminds us that giving access to education and knowledge is the best investment a society can make in the fight against intolerance, isolation, violence, and poverty. Thank you for listening.